Hi everyone, it's Lauren. In this video I'm going to be talking about and reviewing the books that I've read so far in the month of August. Now I have spent 2 weeks of August on holiday, just on a beach, just reading, which has been wonderful, and it means I've actually got through quite a lot of books. So I'm going to be splitting this into 2 videos. So I'm just going to talk about the first 4 today. And the first one that I finished was Mend the Living by Mélie de Kerangal, which is called The Heart in the US. This is, I hesitate to say the story of, but it is the story of a heart transplant, essentially. The way I understood this book before I read it, and from how it had been described to me, I thought that this was going to be specifically the story of Simon's heart's journey from him to the person he donates it to, and all of the different people that his heart touches on the way. But it is a lot more than that, and it's got a very different tone to the one that I expected. The feeling that you get is that we are going on this journey with Simon, really, and all of the different people in his life. But at the same time, we're not part of the entire journey as the audience, as the readers. You really are getting a snapshot, and the feeling that I got from it was that all of these different characters, so Simon's mother, his girlfriend, the doctors and nurses in the hospital that are trying to save him, the people who organise the transplant, the woman who needs to receive a donated heart. It's like all of them are going on their own journeys on different parallel train tracks, and their lives are continuing. And for me, it really felt like you were jumping in with them for a portion of that ride, if you like. But you did get a sense of their entire life. It wasn't just, oh, on this day this was happening. You felt like you understood their pasts and their histories and their personalities, and you were just seeing a glimpse into them. And then you would get off the train, essentially, and their lives would continue. And it really had this feeling of a momentum of life and of like a heartbeat, like continuing. You got this sense that although Simon had gone, essentially he was brain dead, that his heart was going, and you got this sense of what hearts are and what it means to be alive and other people. It was really interesting the way that it's structured, and not just in the overt senses that certain characters are thinking about what a heart means to us kind of metaphorically, but also in the way that it's structured in terms of jumping between characters, and the sentence structures as well are very long. There's some sentences that could last a whole page, and there's lots of pauses with commas, and it really does have this feeling of a continuous rhythm like a heartbeat, and it's very, very interesting the way it's all put together. Obviously, in some instances, very heartbreaking, and also quite philosophical about life and death, and there's some really beautiful moments in there. So I really, really enjoyed this. I thought it was very beautifully written, very quietly arresting. The next book I'm really pleased that I finished because I've been reading it for a very long time, and that is Apollo's Angels by Jennifer Homans, which is a history of ballet. And this has got a bit melted where I was holding it in in the sun. You can see on the spine, like it's almost completely come off. Oh well, but it's quite nice now because it's a bit of a memory of my holiday. This is a completely comprehensive history of ballet, and it's very skillfully done. We start right back in the 16th century in France, to the origins of ballet, and with each chapter she jumps in time but also in location. So we go to Italy, to Denmark, and see how ballet's developing there, in Russia, in Imperial Russia, and then in the Soviet Union. We go to the Royal Ballet in the UK and then finish up in New York. And although obviously ballet and what was happening in these different countries is overlapping, it's interesting in that really the innovation and where ballet was kind of big as part of culture did change within history. So it is like you're kind of following ballet as it grows and changes, but it's also going on a journey around Europe and across the Atlantic, so it is quite interesting. What Jennifer Homans does really well is, although this is a very big book and it is quite complicated, and you know there's lots of technical things that she discusses in here, I did find it very easy to read, even though there's a lot of it to read. So if you're at all interested in ballet, I think this is a fantastic starting point. You wouldn't even have to read all of the chapters if you didn't want to, really. You could just say, oh, I'm interested in learning about Italy, and you could just read the chapter on that. It's quite well structured in that way. What I found quite interesting is that as the timelines converged on the modern day, and we got to periods in history that I knew a bit about already, choreographers I know like Frederick Ashton, Kenneth Macmillan and George Balanchine, I really felt Jennifer Homans' opinions come out in ways that I hadn't noticed in the much more more historic section. So she was a dancer herself, and you know, it's fine to have opinions, but I did find it quite interesting because you know, we all love Balanchine, great, but she loves Balanchine. It's like it is an objective opinion that there's nothing ever that could surpass that, which I was a bit like, I'm not sure that's required in a historical book. But there is an epilogue at the end as well, which is very much her own opinion, which I did really appreciate. And what's interesting is this book is written in 2010, but she kind of ends the history in the mid-80s with Balanchine dying, and sort of in the UK with the end of Margot Fonteyn and Rudolf Nureyev. Sort of that era is where she then closes the door and says, right, that's the end of this history. And she has the opinion that she feels the great innovative parts of ballet and the great masters aren't around anymore, and she doesn't see that ballet is going anywhere. She feels that the art is dying, which I think is such an interesting opinion at the end of the book, which I completely don't agree with, especially from what I see in the UK. But my opinion, conflicting with hers in some aspects, doesn't diminish how much I enjoyed this book or how impressed I am with it as an endeavour, because she's got 400 years of history in here, which is pretty impressive. Next, I read Bodies of Light by Sarah Moss. Sarah Moss is the author of my favourite book from last year, The Tidal Zone, and there are 3 books, The Night Waking, Bodies of Light and Signs for Lost Children, which are quite a loose trilogy. Having read Bodies of Light now, I can see that Night Waking, which came before, isn't necessarily connected to the other 2 books. I think this one and Signs for Lost Children are very much a continuation of the same story, and Night Waking is a bit more of an aside story. It's about some different characters and some different aspects of the same story, but you wouldn't necessarily have to read that first without going into these 2. This is historical fiction, and it's set in the 1800s, and what we are following on the surface of it is the story of these 2 sisters, Alethea and May, and them growing up under a very strict Spartan domineering mother who's very, very religious and very conservative. And essentially it's the story of their lives really growing up within this regime, and it's also looking at the beginnings of girls being allowed to go to school, women being allowed into universities and being allowed to train as doctors, and it's almost them being on the brink of this new future. So there's lots of really interesting themes within the book. We're really looking at the position of women within that time period and looking at thoughts at the time which would have been very shocking and new, which now would be quite common feminist thought, and looking at how women are treated, especially sex workers and poor women. We're looking at attitudes towards mental health and things like hysteria and how that is very gendered. And we're also looking generally at what happens when you are raised in a very, very strict environment, and whether that's something that spurs you on as becomes part of your personality, or whether that's something you're going to rebel against, how that's going to affect you throughout your life. And thematically, I thought it was so interesting, and I really loved all of the points that she was making. In terms of the plot, I found this very oddly structured. We jumped through time very quickly, which I quite liked as a technique, but it did really feel like I was reading, and then she did this, and then she did this, and then she did this, and that's the end of the book. It didn't feel like there was a real obvious plot structure, but I quite liked it. I really enjoyed her writing. It's so easy to read, and although it was like one of those books where not much was happening per se, but there's quite a lot that's being examined, and I definitely feel like Signs for Lost Children is going to be a very obvious sequel, and it's going to continue. And from looking at people's reviews on Goodreads, it sounds like that is a very popular book. I'm really looking forward to reading it, and in hindsight, perhaps this book's kind of laying the groundwork for the second book. And the last book I want to talk about in this video is The Gender Games by Juno Dawson, which I also read on the beach, and I really, really enjoyed this book. I was just thinking about it today, and do you know what? I think while I was reading it, I didn't even appreciate how well it was written, and I think I gave it 3 stars when I finished. And then earlier today, when I was thinking about it, I was like, do you know what? I'm going to go back and change that to 4, because I think Juno's got such a colloquial, familial, easy style that it's almost like you can miss how well structured and put together this book is. So this is Juno Dawson's, I would say, autobiography, but it's really looking at a specific part of her life, which is her issues with gender. She's a transgender woman, but when she was growing up, she kind of thought perhaps that she would be a gay man, so she's kind of coming to terms with her sexuality in one sense, and then also having problems with her identity, and it's looking at how on a wider sense, how our notions of a very strict binary gender makes it very difficult for people like her to kind of understand themselves, but also all of us, and it really puts us in such small boxes. And what I really liked about this is that it is looking at the world through this framework of her life. And what I think is handled really well in this book, which I didn't really notice on the first read because I think it's just done so well that you don't even notice it, is that it's made very clear that these are Juno's opinions, these are her experiences, and this is what she thinks. This is like how she got to this point, how she has found transitioning. Like, she's not trying to speak on behalf of anyone else, but at the same time she manages to have other people within this book. She interviews other people and gets their opinions on different things, and she's definitely examining different aspects of our society, different attitudes towards gender, and it kind of balances that autobiography side and this perhaps just being a book of essays on gender. Like it kind of merges those things together very, very well. So I would really recommend this. I think Juno's got such an easygoing tone that you can read her opinions and her arguments and it's like they came out of your own head. It's like you feel like you thought of them yourself because it's so well explained. And as I said, this is very interesting from two different angles, from that kind of autobiographical, this is an experience from a transgender woman, but it's also so much wider than that and discusses how gender affects everybody and screws everybody over, and no one is really winning from this very binary, strict notions that a lot of us have on gender. So that's it for this video. There will be another one coming at the end of August because I did actually read a few more books on my holiday TBR, one of them being The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which I just finished yesterday and really, really liked. So I will look forward to talking to you about those in that video. Please do get in touch if you have read any of these books. I would love to talk to you about them a little bit more in the comments. What have you been reading in August? Have you been on holiday in August? Let me know everything that you've been doing, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!